Thank you, Brianna, for opening this service. Thanks to the Bicentennial Committee and Pastor Harold Miller for inviting me today. It's an exciting day. We turn the calendar, May 1, 2022. My guess is that in 1822, folks began to dig out here and put up a log structure for a meeting house. And the next year, which is the year the deed is recorded, they decided that it might be a good thing to go down to the courthouse and record the deed. It's a long-standing, reliable tradition, 1822, though the deed, which I've seen, says 1823. It's good to be among family, friends, visitors, our district minister. It's good to have you here today. We are called to remember. I was teaching a Sunday school class this past January using this Revelation 19 text. And we were studying the doxology, and we noted some of the words of judgment embedded in the doxology. And in verse 9, I noticed the two words where God said to John, "Write this." And I was trying to get my adult students to notice, and I didn't do a very good job. To me, those words were what I took from the lesson. Write this. And John sat and he wrote the revelation. Otherwise, how would we know it? Several other times in the book of Revelation, we find the same two words, write this. Only a few are called to write history, but we are all called to remember. The phrase write this is embedded throughout the pages of Scripture. Our Bible is a book of books, of authors centuries ago who took time to sit and write. The two words in this text are write this. Oh, there's a wonderful story in the book of Exodus that also empowers this message that I came across the first time I opened up L.J. Heatwell's church record book some years ago. And on the first page of Bishop L.J. Heatwell's record book, he used Exodus 17:14. It's a story of Moses in the Sinai, and as long as he had his hands up in the air, the Israelites were winning the battle against the enemy. And God said to Moses, take the scroll and write these stories down. Why? As something to be remembered. Exodus 17:14. That verse propels my work, my writing, my research. Write these things on a scroll, God said to Moses, as something to be remembered. So why should we write a history book? Brianna, it's not quite finished yet. I brought along what's called proofs. There are 5 members of your church after the service today that I'm going to give a copy to. It's our last chance to read and look for mistakes. The hard work of editing is at the end. It's almost there, but not quite. We all need, the book committee needs to have proof and really work on this one last round. Why should we write such a book? First, we do so in order that we who are here at the Bicentennial can remember the stories of God's faithfulness at Trissels and in this northern district of the Virginia Mennonite Conference. So we can remember the stories. Otherwise, how do we know the story of Moses with his hands up in the air? It's in the scroll of the book of Exodus. How do we know this doxology? John went back and wrote it down. One of my favorite stories in the book and the story of Trissels is a story of Catherine Rhodes Shank. She lived in the 1800s, 1831 to 1875. She passed away at a young age, we would say 44. She died in 1875 of pneumonia. Today's hospital, she probably would have lived much longer. She was a granddaughter to Henry and Elizabeth Rhodes, Bishop Henry Rhodes, early Linville settlers who came to this area a few years after the Revolutionary War ended. Seemed like a long time ago, but in 1784, the Revolutionary War was ended and Mennonites began moving up the valley to the Linville Creek area from Pennsylvania and Maryland. She attended church, Catherine Rhodes Shank did, in the log building that was out here. There's a little marker in the cemetery. She would have seen her grandfather, Henry Rhodes's German language songbook, which he donated to the church. There was a wooden chest in the log frame building with that songbook in it. He donated it. A copy of it is still in your library over here. Check it out sometime and look at that German language songbook. Many of Catherine Rhodes' family are buried in the Rhodes Cemetery at the intersection of Trissels Road and 42. Come back for the tour this fall, and we'll go to that cemetery. Catherine, though, is buried here at Trissels. Every time I walk in your cemetery, I walk over to take a look at Catherine Rhodes Shanks' tombstone, a woman of faith. We think she married Samuel, well, we know she married Samuel Shank Jr., but we don't know when. It may have been written down, but we don't have the record. Her daughter, Sarah, wrote that Catherine usually dressed in colors. She wore a cape and an apron, made clothes for the family without a sewing machine, and helped to operate their family farm. One day, October of 1864, Union soldiers, young men probably in their 20s and 30s, came to the farm, the Shank farm, and they torched the barn, and the sparks jumped over onto the house, and the house also burned. We'll drive by the Shank farm in our tour in September, talk about that burning. She had to restrain her husband, Samuel, from trying to save things out of the house. Samuel ran in and got a walnut table and the family Bible, and that was it. The house burned, the barn burned. Nobody knows how they survived that next winter, the starving winter here in the valley. After the burning, 3 of Catherine Rhodes Shank's sons became ministers in the Northern District. Lewis Shank, a handful of you here might remember Lewis Shank preaching here or in the wood frame building. Joseph and Perry Shank. Perry was 5 at the time of his mother's funeral here in the cemetery. Perry then married Katie, and they were children of, here are names you might recognize. Remember, J. Ward Shank, David Paul Shank, John Franklin Shank, Samuel S. Shank, and Martha Shank Wisson. Martha was born in 1914. As World War I was starting up in Europe, there was talk of starting school in the valley, and Martha Shank was born. She attended both Trissels and Zion until the friendly separation in 1947 between Zion. My wife and I both taught Sunday school this morning at Zion. It's fun to make that drive across the way to Trissels and attend both services on a Sunday morning. In her 30s, Martha began attending Zion because she lived on the other side of 42. And that was sort of the dividing line. I got to know Martha, a granddaughter of Catherine Rhodes Shank, in the 1990s when Joy and I began attending Zion. I interviewed her a number of times. I still consider Martha Shank Wisson, the granddaughter of Catherine Rhodes Shank, my first teacher of Virginia Mennonite history. She was patient. She had a twinkle in her eye. She'd tell me things, and when I should have known something or known better, she was patient and she would help me, and she taught me the Southern graces, just how it is, and she showed me her books, told me about Virginia history. I'll never forget sitting in her kitchen talking about Virginia Mennonite history and the story of Zion and Trissels. Martha passed away 3 years ago. Some of you came over to Zion for that funeral. She was 105 years of age. Now think of this. Catherine Rhodes Shank buried out here. Her son Perry, his daughter Martha, they spanned 188 years. Got to be a record. Like her grandmother, Martha was a woman of deep faith in God, courage, and resilience. The story of Catherine Rhodes Shank and her descendants is a story I've tried to tell as well as I could in this book, using all the detail I could get. Someday, walk out there and read the inscription from Revelation 14 on her tombstone. We write the history of the Trissels congregation so we can remember the stories of God's faithfulness here at Trissels. Let me tell you the story of J. Hopkins Turner. 1871 to 1945. People just called him Hop. Tall, raw-boned, easy to understand. Hop grew up in the mountains near Criders, Virginia. And at the age of 43, Hop came to know Jesus Christ as the Lord and Savior through a revival meeting in Criders Schoolhouse up on a hill. It was so packed. Edward J. Berkey came through and preached. Over 40 people gave their lives to Christ, and Hop was one of them. He was ordained shortly thereafter because they needed more ministers out there in the Criders area, and Hop began to preach. Oh, they say he only had 6 to 10 sermons. He was a mountain man, but he stopped at 20 minutes. I was asked how long I was going to preach today. Hop preached about 20 minutes and he stopped. And people liked it. And he had the same sermons. And he had some of the same expressions. And when the Titanic sank in 1912, that moved Hop Turner. And he used that illustration again and again and again, over and over again in his sermons. He was tall. He was a mountain man, much more at home tracking deer than preaching a sermon. There's one really nice photo in the book of Hop Turner with his brothers, these big, tall mountain men. The other two guys have suit coats on. Hop put on the plain coat. He was ordained a minister in the Virginia Conference, and he agreed to wear the plain coat as a sign that he was a minister in the Virginia Conference. Hop preached in the wood frame building over here on numerous occasions on the calendar system. J. Ward Shank and Hop Turner went down to the Bank Mennonite Church one time to preach. And they walked in there and they sat up on the minister's bench, probably early 40s, maybe late 30s, and started filling up with people at the Bank Mennonite Church down near Dayton. And they're sitting up here on the bench, and Hop leans over to Ward and says, "You know, Ward, I think I got to the wrong place." He was really uncomfortable with a lot of people coming in to listen to him preach. But he felt called of God to do so, and he did. He and his wife, Bertie, and 2 of their children are buried in your cemetery here. I'm inspired by his story each time I review and learn it. Secondly, we write this history book so that new people who join the Trissels story going forward can learn and remember the stories. As you begin, can I say this, your 3rd century? As you move into the 3rd century of this congregation with its history and keep building, that was a good word, Tim. New people will join the story who don't know the Shanks and the Giles and the Rhodeses of the past. A book is one way we help them learn and remember those stories. Okay, I use these initials, HTH. Who can say the 3 names that go with those initials? Eunice. Start with Howard. Daniel. Hercus, yes. Howard Daniel Hercus Showalter married Flora or Flossie Grove in 1908. There's a really nice photo in the book of them getting married in 1908. Stately photo, state-of-the-art clothes, really nice wedding dress. She did her hair up, 1908. Before the conservative era of the early 20th century started, Later photos of the couple and their children, it's plain. And things changed in the 1920s. Wait till you read the book and look at the photos. But when HDH married Flossie, they got married in Augusta County in her home, and it was a lovely wedding. They had music. Details in the newspaper from Augusta County tell us about that wedding. They lived silently the first few years, but then he changed over. Oh, HDH, he didn't much like the plain coat. He wore it once for the bishop. He said, never again. So he wore some other kind of coat that looked plain, but he didn't put up with the plain coat. A number of Virginians, the locals here, resisted that era of significant change that happened in the 1920s and the 1930s. Later, you'll see in the book, there are 9 children, I believe it was, those who lived with them. HDH cared about this congregation. He's probably the only person that we're aware of. We can't think of anybody else who attended the church here in the log church before 1900. In the wood frame building, 1900 and 1950. He attended church here in the brick building, 1950, and he would have attended church when the fellowship hall was built in 1965, because he passed in 1969. HDH cared about the cemetery. In 1947, there was a series of meetings. Should Trissels and Zion merge, move out along the highway, the main road, put up a big structure and move away from this building and the one over there? The older men said, no. What are we going to do with our cemeteries? The one at Zion, the one at Trissels. Some of the younger folks, and I named them in the book because we have those records, said we ought to move, we ought to merge. And there was a very amicable, friendly discussion of that. But by the end of 47, they decided to keep the buildings where they are. The churches would begin meeting on a regular basis at their locations. HDH cared about the cemetery, and he would be happy that there are still folks today that care about the cemetery and do the work of managing it. Oh, you have to read the book to get the number of people buried in the cemetery. It's a very high number. I worked with Don Lord to get some details for the last chapter of the book. Oh, which one of HDH and Flora Showalter's children has the book that has sold the most copies of any EMU, EMC professor? And what's the name of the book? Probably some of your dinners are being made from recipes from that Mennonite community cookbook. It sold more copies than any other professor in the 100 and some years of Eastern Mennonite School. Another story, Ida Moyers. She passed away in 1974. At the age of 33, Ida Moyers wrote a letter from out near Highland Retreat where they lived. And she wrote a letter to Maddie Shanks, the wife of the bishop. She said, our family would like to join the Mennonites. 1914. They were going to leave the United Brethren Church and join the Mennonites. Maddie, in her little note, Eunice got me this little note in the files. Maddie, Ida needed a covering and a bonnet. If she was going to join the Mennonites, she had to have a covering and a bonnet. So Maddie Shanks, the bishop's wife, took one to her. They moved into Broadway, where Benjamin became a successful businessman. Benjamin died, though, in 1935, and Ida lived another 39 years as a widow. Well, the Virginia Conference in the late 1920s, the ministers decided that radios were a thing that should be prohibited. Now think of that. 100 years ago, radios was the thing where the ministers drew the line. Ida put her radio up in the attic, dutifully, and followed the guidelines of the ministers. 2 of her sons did not, and they chose to leave the conference. They were young men in their 20s, and they said, no, we want the radio, we need to use it for this or that, and they decided to leave the conference rather than abide by the codes of the ministers. There was another son of Ida and Benjamin Moyers by the name of Preston Moyers. Many of you remember Preston. He served 2 years with civilian public service during World War II in Maine, learning the dairy business on a very large farm in Maine. Later, Preston married Mary Brunk from the Middle District. And Preston later served as an elder here during the difficult days of division in the 1980s. Preston Moyers. Ida Moyers' only daughter, Virginia Moyers Martin, graduated from EMS and attended Trissels and Zion for many years. Ida and Benjamin Moyers and their daughter, Virginia Moyers Martin, are buried at Zion, while Preston and Mary Brunt Moyers are buried here in the Trissels Cemetery. Ever since Zion began in 1885, Zion and Trissels have been two congregations that have been partners together in a lot of ways. Third, we write a history book so that we can remember and hear the stories from the past so they encourage and instruct us in our faith today. So by 1947, the minister is embarrassed that we made a mistake on the radio. And they had to rescind that ruling, and people needed radios for the weather forecast, especially for their farms. Ida went up in her attic and brought the radio back down and began to use the radio again in her home. Within 3 years of that radio prohibition being rescinded, what international radio ministry began here in this area? The Mennonite Hour. Carl Showalter, one of HTH's sons, was on the board at the beginning. And they turned a prohibition into a tremendous ministry with studios in Harrisonburg. And the radio was used as a ministry across the United States. It was called the Mennonite Hour. About 1962 to be exact, a very young man by the name of David Augsburger came in here. He was young, 20 couple, and he became a co-pastor here working along with Norman Yutzi. And he learned how to be a pastor here at Trissels, David Augsburger. In the 1960s, early 70s, David Augsburger has this low bass, soothing, easy to listen to voice, unlike mine, I suppose. And he became the voice of the Mennonite Hour. And as I studied Augsburger's story, David Augsburger, he would write for the Mennonite Hour and use that material in his sermons here. He wrote for the Gospel Herald. He was producing a lot of thought and content. Well, the Vietnam War took place in the 60s. David Augsburger said, the US was on the wrong side of that conflict. And David Augsburger, as a young man, began to speak on the Mennonite Hour against US involvement in Vietnam. And big radio stations across the US began to cancel the Mennonite Hour. They didn't like that message of peace and nonviolence. David Augsburger asked the executive board of the Mennonite Hour, he asked the elders here, is it okay if I keep speaking against the war? They said yes. And Augsburger developed his voice. There were some stations out there that dropped the Mennonite Hour, but he kept speaking into what it means to be a Mennonite. In fact, by the late 60s, I think it was, Augsburger gave a message on what it means to be a Mennonite. It became a famous sort of statement about what are the basic elements. But Augsburger was learning here as a pastor. So 3 years ago, I was a delegate for Zion to Mennonite Church USA in Kansas City. And Joy and I were there, and across the hall during a break, I happened to see David Augsburger. He was standing there talking to people. So I made my way over there 3 years ago. And I said, David, you probably don't know who I am, but I'm writing a history book about Trissels Mennonite Church. He began to click off stories just right there. It just came out of his brain. And he was telling me a story. I said, well, wait a minute, David. I need to interview you. I have to write it down. So we arranged. I got his email. During COVID, we got on Zoom. He was in California where he lives. And for an hour, David came and told me stories of the 60s, early 70s. I'm not going to tell you any of them because he's coming in October, Lord willing. And the stories, many of them are in the book. You'll have to read them and listen to David this fall. But he has a very good memory of stories, what it means to be faithful here at Trissels in the 60s and 70s. And he talked again and again about working with Norman Yutzi and learning from Norman during the 1960s. During the end of that 1-hour Zoom conversation, David began to counsel me. David's a counselor, professional counselor. He began to listen to me talk about my observations of the conference, of the church, and how it's changing. And he helped me in ways that I can hardly explain to be encouraged and renewed through that conversation. Well, which stories do I drop here? I'm at 20 minutes or further. I'll tell one more story. Am I allowed, Joy, to tell one more story? All right. One of the persons that many of you will remember is Vivian Beachy. Going forward into the 3rd century, many new people will not know the story of Vivian Beachy. We have a photo or two of her in the book. She attended church here from 1988 to 2003 for 15 years. Now, I overlapped on the Eastern Mennonite High School faculty for 7 years with Vivian Beachy. She frightened me. She was the senior member of the faculty. She'd been there close to 40 years, and what she said went. I was a new teacher. I learned my place. But she was kind to me. She said at one point, she said, Elwood, don't let your students get by with poor writing. I'll never forget that. She was strict. Some of you had her as a teacher years ago. But she taught sentence diagramming, and she was a good English teacher. In the 1980s, Zion was filled to capacity with college students and everybody, and you could hardly get a seat. So Vivian and some others migrated over to Trissels after the division because there was plenty of room here. She came over and was involved here for 15 years. Vivian was a woman of faith in God. She participated in the life of this congregation, and she served as an elder. She made dozens of baby blankets for relief. She appreciated the different styles of music. How do we know? She wrote this stuff down. Write this, remember? And she said she always relished the charcoal aroma of a men's meal. If you don't know what that is, read the book. In 2003, Vivian moved back to Delaware where she had grown up, and she passed away in 2010. I hope her story told in these pages of our book will encourage others. Believers are called to remember the stories of faith from the past, as we've learned from John and Moses. First, of course, are the stories of the Bible, which is why you run summer Bible school and Sunday schools for children. Our faith, Christianity and Judaism, is a faith where history matters. We're people of the book. We study the biblical stories, and we write other stories to nurture our faith today. In October, I'll say a little bit more about documents and sources, say a few more things in a little different vein when I come back in October. I am grateful. I'm grateful for and Susan and Robbie and Harold and Joyce. For the last 4 years, these people have been getting to know me. I'm getting to know we work together hard, and we're not quite finished to get this book produced. I saw something again in this Revelation 19 passage, and I'll quit here. As Brianna was reading this, I noticed something in verse, just as I was sitting back here. Then I heard, John wrote, what sounded like a great multitude, like the roar of rushing waters and like loud peals of thunder shouting. John listened to the roar of rushing waters. He wrote about it. In the summer of 2018, my first morning of work on this book project, I drove out here. There'd been a lot of rain the previous weekend, and I stopped down here at the Cedar Run Creek, and it was full and rushing with water. The water was coming up over the road. I stopped and got out, and I could see the church up on the hill here, the big oak trees. And I knew I was getting into something, significant, 200 years worth. And the water seemed to call out a message to me, inviting me into the story of 200 years. It was one of those moments in nature where you can't hardly explain it. And this morning I noticed it in Revelation 19. John also heard from the rushing waters. I invite you into this story when the book comes out this fall in order to tell and remember the stories of God's faithfulness. Secondly, so the new people going forward who join this Trissels story can learn and remember those stories. And third, so that these stories from the past can encourage and instruct. If you notice the Revelation passage, there's a bit of instruction in there, a bit of judgment in there. So these stories from the past can encourage and instruct our faith in God. And the angel said to John, write this. And we have. Thank you.